London whispered that Duke Julian Ashford had only 30 days to save everything his family had built. His late grandfather's will demanded one impossible condition: remain legally married for 30 consecutive days, convince the royal council the marriage was genuine, or surrender Ashford Castle, thousands of acres and generations of honor to Lord Victor Blackwell. Julian trusted contracts because people had betrayed him. Years earlier, his celebrated engagement had ended before London's highest society when his fiancée abandoned him for greater influence. Since then, discipline replaced hope, routine silenced longing, and every promise required ink instead of trust. Across the countryside, Miss Rosalie Everhart measured wealth differently. Every loaf shared, every lesson taught, every frightened child comforted mattered more than titles. She taught music inside the orphanage her late parents had founded, filling worn halls with gentle melodies that softened hungry hearts. The building leaned with age, the roof leaked whenever rain arrived, yet laughter still echoed through every corridor because Rosalie refused to spare entry. That fragile refuge stood upon valuable land desired by ruthless investors. When stern bailiffs arrived carrying eviction papers, frightened children clung to Rosalie's skirts while neighbors watched helplessly. She stepped before the officers with quiet courage, refusing to move until every child found safety. Her voice never rose, but her conviction stopped stronger people than herself. Julian happened to witness the confrontation while returning from estate business. Hidden inside his carriage, he expected pleading or panic. Instead, he saw compassion standing unshaken against power. Rosalie neither begged nor cursed. She simply declared that frightened children deserved dignity before profit. Something unfamiliar stirred beneath the armor surrounding his guarded heart. Later that afternoon, the Duke's solicitor reminded him the inheritance deadline had become dangerously close. 5 official appearances, 1 convincing marriage, shared nights beneath the same roof, and unmistakable affection would satisfy the will. Any suspicion of deception would transfer everything to Lord Victor, whose polished smile concealed relentless ambition. Victor had already begun courting influential council members, waiting patiently for Julian to fail. Julian requested a private meeting with Rosalie. She entered the village schoolroom still wearing her simple blue dress, chalk dust lingering upon her sleeves. He offered an extraordinary bargain. Marry him for 30 days. Save the orphanage forever. Walk away afterward with complete independence. Rosalie listened without interrupting, then quietly refused. She believed marriage deserved devotion, not calculation. No amount of money could justify promising vows without love. Julian accepted the rejection with surprising calm, thanked her politely, and departed. Yet her answer lingered inside him because she had valued truth above wealth, exactly the quality every fashionable noblewoman had lacked. 2 days later the orphanage received its final notice. Unless impossible debts were paid within 72 hours, the children would lose their home forever. Rosalie spent that evening repairing torn blankets beside tiny beds while pretending confidence none of the children believed. After everyone slept, she cried silently beside her parents' faded portrait, asking forgiveness because love alone could not protect the family they had built. Before dawn another carriage arrived. Julian stepped into the mist carrying the unsigned agreement. He spoke without pride or persuasion. He merely explained that he needed a wife willing to protect something greater than herself, and he believed she was the only person capable of making strangers believe kindness could become love. Rosalie stared toward the orphanage windows where sleepy faces watched anxiously behind worn curtains. Her decision arrived with heartbreaking stillness. She would sacrifice her certainty so the children could keep theirs. Hands trembling, she signed the contract containing every impossible rule. No kissing. No falling in love. After 30 days they would separate forever, regardless of whatever changed between them. Julian signed beside her, careful not to meet her searching eyes. The journey to Ashford Castle began beneath a sunrise washed in pale gold. Rolling hills shimmered with morning dew while horses carried them through quiet forests scented by pine and damp earth. Rosalie watched villages disappear behind them, wondering whether she had rescued the children or abandoned herself. Julian noticed her silence yet respected it, offering only practical observations about the estate instead of meaningless comfort. Ashford Castle rose beyond the trees like something carved from forgotten dreams. Towering stone walls caught the early light, stained glass glowed softly, and countless windows reflected a future neither traveler understood. Inside, astonished servants greeted their unexpected Duchess. The formidable housekeeper supervised tailors, jewelers, and hairdressers until the village teacher gradually disappeared beneath graceful silk, delicate lace, and quiet elegance. Rosalie barely recognized the poised young woman staring back from polished mirrors. Days passed inside a whirlwind of transformation. She practiced formal greetings, mastered complicated table etiquette, memorized noble families, and stumbled through endless ballroom rehearsals. Julian corrected every mistake with remarkable patience, never mocking her uncertainty. When she accidentally stepped upon his polished shoes during a waltz, embarrassment overwhelmed her, yet he surprised both of them by laughing softly. The sound felt astonishingly warm inside echoing halls accustomed only to measured footsteps. Servants soon whispered that Sunshine had entered Ashford Castle wearing borrowed pearls. Rosalie learned names instead of titles, thanked exhausted maids, praised nervous footmen, and filled silent corridors with music from an old piano forgotten inside the library. Even the elderly gardener smiled again after she admired his roses. Julian noticed these quiet miracles accumulating around her, unsettling convictions he once believed permanent. Their first royal banquet arrived sooner than expected. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished floors while London's nobility examined every smile, gesture, and glance exchanged between the newly married couple. When the orchestra began a graceful waltz, Julian extended his hand without hesitation. Rosalie accepted. They moved together with unexpected harmony until the final note faded into breathless silence. Neither realized their fingers remained intertwined longer than propriety allowed. Across the glittering ballroom, Lord Victor watched that lingering touch, smiled almost invisibly, and decided the game had finally become worth winning. Neither understood how dangerous that moment was. Morning sunlight spilled across Ashford Castle as another demanding day of appearances began. The Royal Council never announced when its observers were present, making every conversation, smile, and gesture part of an invisible examination. Julian reminded himself that success depended upon discipline, while Rosalie reminded herself that 30 days passed quickly when measured against a lifetime of safety for the orphanage. Yet pretending grew harder each sunrise because the performance no longer felt entirely false. Their first official outing after the banquet led them to London's celebrated flower festival. Streets overflowed with roses, lavender, lilies, and climbing vines draped across elegant arches. Noble families admired expensive displays, but Rosalie wandered toward elderly gardeners whose weathered hands had nurtured every blossom. Julian watched her compliment each arrangement with genuine delight, and the gardeners rewarded her with simple bouquets rather than rehearsed flattery. For the first time in years, the Duke enjoyed attending an event instead of merely enduring it. The following afternoon they visited a quiet lake surrounded by ancient willow trees. White swans glided across shimmering water while children tossed breadcrumbs from a wooden pier. Rosalie laughed as one bold swan stretched its graceful neck toward Julian, demanding another handful. He pretended annoyance, though amusement softened his expression. When she reached to brush a stray feather from his sleeve, both hesitated, suddenly aware of how natural such tenderness had become. Their schedule carried them onward to prestigious horse races attended by Britain's highest society. Julian expertly guided Rosalie through complicated introductions, protecting her from subtle insults disguised as compliments. Whenever aristocrats questioned her humble background, he answered before she could, speaking of her intelligence with unmistakable respect. She realized he defended her reputation as instinctively as he defended his own estate, and gratitude quietly settled beside emotions she refused to name. A countryside ride followed several days later. They crossed rolling hills painted gold beneath late summer sunshine while wildflowers swayed beside narrow trails. Rosalie admitted she had never ridden beyond her village before. Julian slowed his horse, allowing her confidence to grow instead of racing ahead. They shared stories carried by warm winds, discovering unexpected similarities hidden beneath vastly different lives. Both had lost parents too young. Both had inherited responsibilities before understanding adulthood. Both secretly feared disappointing people who depended upon them. Back at Ashford Castle, the head chef injured his wrist preparing a grand dinner for visiting diplomats. Without hesitation, Rosalie volunteered to help in the kitchens despite wearing an elegant afternoon gown. Flower dust soon decorated expensive sleeves while laughter echoed among astonished cooks. Julian entered searching for tea and found his temporary wife kneading bread beside smiling servants. She handed him a wooden spoon and calmly ordered him to stir soup before it burned. No one had ever commanded a duke inside his own castle. Instead of objecting, he obeyed. That evening, every guest praised the remarkable meal. Julian accepted compliments without revealing who truly deserved them. Beneath the polished table, Rosalie accidentally nudged his hand while passing fresh rolls. Neither withdrew immediately. Tiny moments like these accumulated quietly, weaving invisible threads stronger than either wished to acknowledge. Escaping endless conversation became their shared secret. During another formal reception, Rosalie noticed Julian growing increasingly weary beneath endless political debates. Without speaking, she slipped onto a moonlit terrace overlooking sculpted gardens. Moments later he joined her carrying 2 cups of warm tea. They stood together listening to distant violins drifting through open windows while fireflies shimmered above blooming roses. Silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It became peaceful, almost necessary. Rain interrupted their return indoors. Julian opened one large umbrella, instinctively drawing Rosalie close beneath its shelter. Their shoulders brushed with every careful step across glistening stone paths. She smiled upward as raindrops danced upon the fabric overhead, remarking that storms always made the world smell cleaner afterward. Julian realized he had begun noticing ordinary beauty simply because she noticed it first. Another council appearance required an afternoon inside the castle library. Officially they discussed estate charities before distinguished guests. Unofficially they escaped into shelves filled with forgotten poetry once the visitors departed. Rosalie selected a worn volume and read gentle verses aloud beside the crackling fireplace. Julian pretended concentration upon financial ledgers, yet found himself listening only to her voice. Warm amber light illuminated drifting dust while quiet companionship settled comfortably around them. He could scarcely remember the last time Ashford Castle had felt inhabited instead of merely occupied. The estate's grand countryside picnic arrived at week's end, drawing nobles, artists, and journalists eager to witness the celebrated newlyweds. Long linen blankets stretched across emerald grass beneath towering oaks. Crystal glasses sparkled beside baskets overflowing with fresh fruit, warm bread, and fragrant pastries. Rosalie removed her gloves, delighted by simple daisies growing freely beyond carefully arranged gardens. She gathered one delicate bloom and absent-mindedly twirled it between graceful fingers. A famous society photographer requested one commemorative portrait before sunset. Julian and Rosalie stood together overlooking the castle while golden light bathed the landscape behind them. Unsatisfied, the photographer politely adjusted their positions. "A little closer, Your Grace," he said with encouraging enthusiasm. Julian obeyed. Rosalie scarcely breathed. Their faces drifted within inches of one another until only the tiny daisy separated them. Her cheeks flushed crimson. His heartbeat became impossibly loud. The bustling crowd disappeared. For one suspended moment, neither remembered contracts, councils, nor carefully constructed boundaries. They simply looked into each other's eyes, wondering how pretending had become so dangerously convincing. Applause erupted after the photograph, breaking the spell. Rosalie stepped back first, embarrassed by emotions she could neither explain nor permit. Julian spent the journey home unusually quiet, replaying every heartbeat beneath that fading sunset. Hidden among departing guests, Lady Celeste Beaumont watched their closeness with tightening fury. That night she bribed a desperate footman, unlocked Julian's private study, and quietly removed the signed marriage contract from the hidden safe. Smiling beneath candlelight, she folded the document into her cloak, knowing every forbidden rule now rested in her hands alone. London changed its opinion with frightening speed. The same noblewomen who had praised Rosalie's elegance at the flower festival now lowered their voices whenever she entered a room. Gentle smiles disappeared behind polished fans, replaced by whispers sharp enough to wound. Every newspaper seemed eager to speculate how an unknown village teacher had somehow become Duchess of Ashford. Rosalie pretended not to notice, but every rumor settled heavily upon her heart. Lady Celeste Beaumont quietly fueled the growing gossip. Using the stolen marriage contract as her weapon, she hinted to influential ladies that the Duke's marriage had never been born from affection. She never revealed the document itself. Instead, she allowed curiosity to spread naturally, knowing suspicion often proved more destructive than certainty. By the week's end, London's drawing rooms buzzed with elegant lies disguised as concern. Lord Victor Blackwell watched events unfold with patient satisfaction. He bribed journalists, entertained council members with lavish dinners, and quietly suggested that Ashford Castle deserved an owner whose honor remained unquestioned. Every rumor strengthened his position without requiring him to speak publicly against his own nephew. Rosalie soon discovered how deeply the poison had spread. During a charitable concert hosted by the Royal Academy, she overheard 2 distinguished ladies standing behind velvet curtains. "I hear she sold 30 days of marriage. How fortunate for the Duke that affection can be purchased." The cruel words struck harder than either woman intended. Rosalie continued walking without revealing she had heard everything, yet the music she performed moments later carried a sorrow so profound that several listeners quietly wiped tears from their eyes without understanding why. Julian noticed immediately. When applause faded and guests returned to conversation, he found her alone beneath the marble staircase overlooking the grand entrance hall. "You played beautifully." She smiled faintly. "I've always believed music tells the truth people refuse to say aloud." He sensed hidden pain but respected her silence. His instinct urged him to comfort her, yet the contract had taught him to measure every emotional step with caution. For the first time in years, caution felt unbearable. Days later they visited the orphanage together under the pretense of inspecting charitable investments. The children rushed toward Rosalie with joyful laughter, surrounding her before she could even leave the carriage. Julian watched tiny hands cling to her dress while bright faces competed for her attention. She remembered every birthday, every favorite story, every forgotten promise. Even after becoming Duchess, nothing about her kindness had changed. One little girl tugged gently upon Julian's sleeve. "Your Grace." He looked down. "Is Miss Rosalie happy in your castle?" The innocent question lingered unexpectedly. Julian glanced toward Rosalie, who laughed as several boys attempted to teach an elderly goose new tricks. "I hope she is," he answered quietly. The child smiled. "Then you must keep making her smile." Those simple words echoed inside him long after they departed. Returning home, Julian abandoned official paperwork and invited Rosalie into the empty ballroom. Hundreds of candles reflected across polished floors while moonlight poured through towering windows. No orchestra waited. Only silence. He extended his hand. "One dance." She accepted. Without formal audiences or judging eyes, every movement felt effortless. They no longer counted practice steps or corrected mistakes. They simply moved together while quiet music from a distant violin drifted through open corridors. Their conversation wandered from childhood dreams to forgotten fears. Rosalie confessed she had once hoped to travel England teaching music in villages. Julian admitted he had dreamed of painting landscapes before duty claimed every hour of his life. "You still could," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "Dukes rarely belong to themselves." She looked into his eyes. "Perhaps that has always been the saddest part." Neither realized how closely they stood until the final note disappeared. Neither stepped away. Morning brought another cruel surprise. Anonymous pamphlets appeared throughout London claiming the Duchess had married solely for money. Though unsigned, everyone suspected hidden enemies worked carefully behind the accusations. Servants whispered. Merchants stared. Even respected friends hesitated before greeting Rosalie in public. Rather than defend herself, she worried only about Julian. If enough doubt reached the royal council, he would lose everything because of her. That evening she secretly decided the contract must end early. If she disappeared before the scandal worsened, perhaps the Duke could still persuade the council he had been deceived as well. The decision shattered her heart. She packed nothing. She merely prepared herself to leave quietly once the orphanage received its promised funds. Unaware of her plan, Julian suggested one final countryside ride before Parliament resumed its endless meetings. Rosalie agreed because she knew it would likely become their last peaceful afternoon together. Golden sunlight welcomed them across rolling meadows where wheat danced beneath gentle breezes. They stopped beside a winding river, sharing bread, fresh berries, and quiet conversation upon smooth stones warmed by afternoon light. Neither mentioned approaching separation, though both somehow felt its shadow growing nearer. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered with unnatural speed. Thunder rolled across distant hills. Their carriage hurried toward Ashford Castle, but violent rain soon swallowed the narrow road. Horses panicked beneath blinding lightning. A frightened wheel struck hidden rocks, sending the carriage violently sideways before crashing into a muddy embankment. Julian shielded Rosalie as splintered wood shattered around them. Both escaped shaken but unharmed. Rain poured mercilessly across the countryside. In the distance stood an abandoned stone chapel forgotten by time. They ran together through freezing wind until heavy doors groaned open beneath Julian's hands. Inside, cracked stained glass windows glimmered whenever lightning illuminated faded saints upon ancient walls. Water dripped rhythmically from broken rafters while cold silence wrapped itself around the deserted sanctuary. Only then did Rosalie's composure finally collapse. Tears spilled freely. "I'm destroying your life," she whispered through trembling breaths. "Every day another rumor spreads. Every smile we shared has become another reason they'll take everything from you." Julian stepped closer. No. You've brought life back into my home. She shook her head desperately. I was never supposed to matter. You were only supposed to stay 30 days. Lightning exploded outside. She flinched. He gently brushed rain-soaked curls away from her face. His fingertips lingered against her cheek. For one suspended heartbeat, neither remembered the contract. Neither remembered the council. Neither remembered tomorrow. Rosalie slipped upon the damp stone floor. Julian caught her instinctively. Their faces met within inches. Without planning it, without permission, their lips found one another. The kiss remained soft, tender, almost impossibly gentle. It lasted only moments. Yet within those fragile seconds, every carefully written rule quietly surrendered to feelings neither could deny any longer. When they finally separated, neither spoke. They simply looked into each other's rain-bright eyes, understanding their lives had changed forever. Outside the chapel, hidden behind a crumbling stone wall, a cloaked photographer lowered his camera after capturing the forbidden kiss. Smiling grimly, he tucked the photograph safely beneath his coat before disappearing into the storm, already riding toward Lord Victor with the proof that could destroy everything Julian and Rosalie had begun to believe was real. Morning arrived without peace. Rain still clung to Ashford Castle's windows as though the storm had followed Julian and Rosalie home, refusing to release either heart from its grip. Neither mentioned the kiss during breakfast, yet silence carried more meaning than conversation ever could. Every accidental glance lingered too long. Every shared breath reminded them that one forbidden moment had changed everything the contract demanded they remain. Julian retreated into endless meetings with solicitors, hoping duty might restore the distance he had carefully maintained for years. Instead, every document reminded him of promises already broken. Ink could define obligations, but it possessed no power over affection. For the first time since inheriting Ashford Castle, he questioned whether his grandfather had truly intended to protect the estate or simply force him to rediscover the courage to love. Rosalie spent her mornings teaching music to village children invited onto the estate, refusing to let private confusion steal joy from innocent lives. She smiled while guiding tiny hands across piano keys, yet every melody carried echoes of the chapel where one unexpected kiss had rewritten her future. She feared happiness because happiness made leaving impossible, and she believed leaving remained the only way to save Julian from ruin. Lord Victor wasted no time. The stolen marriage contract reached selected members of the Royal Council alongside the secretly captured photograph outside the abandoned chapel. He presented both with polished restraint, pretending reluctant concern rather than triumphant ambition. If the Duke had entered a fraudulent marriage merely to satisfy the inheritance, Ashford Castle legally belonged elsewhere. Several council members demanded an immediate hearing. Lady Celeste added her own cruelty. She hosted elegant afternoon gatherings where London's nobility discussed the scandal beneath crystal chandeliers and fragrant roses. Without raising her voice, she suggested Rosalie had planned everything from the beginning. Wealthy guests eagerly accepted the story because betrayal entertained society more than kindness ever could. The official summons arrived 3 days later. Julian unfolded the royal seal without visible emotion. Rosalie recognized disaster before reading a single line. The council required both husband and wife to appear before Parliament Hall within 48 hours to answer accusations concerning the legitimacy of their marriage. Failure would be interpreted as admission of guilt. Julian calmly assured everyone the truth would prevail. Rosalie wished she shared his confidence. That evening she wandered through Ashford Castle long after servants retired. Moonlight spilled across familiar corridors that no longer felt borrowed. Every room held memories impossible to pack inside a traveling case. The ballroom remembered laughter. The library remembered poetry. The kitchens remembered warm bread shared with smiling cooks. She realized she had accidentally fallen in love not only with one remarkable man but with an entire home slowly learning happiness again. Instead of surrendering to grief, she chose gratitude. If departure awaited her, she would leave the castle better than she had found it. At dawn she entered the neglected rose garden carrying gloves, pruning shears and determination. 4 hours she trimmed dying branches, planted fresh blooms, and cleared forgotten pathways until vibrant color returned to soil abandoned for years. Elderly gardeners silently joined her, inspired more by example than instruction. By afternoon the once forgotten garden breathed with renewed life. The following morning she visited servant quarters rather than grand salons. She repaired torn uniforms, wrote letters for elderly workers unable to hold steady pens, and personally thanked each member of the household for welcoming a frightened village teacher as though she truly belonged among them. More than one maid quietly cried after embracing her goodbye without understanding why farewell suddenly felt so near. She continued giving pieces of herself wherever she walked. Stable boys struggling to read discovered patient lessons beneath shady oak trees. Lonely kitchen maids learned forgotten songs from her childhood. The elderly butler found fresh spectacles waiting neatly upon his desk because Rosalie had secretly arranged them. Even the Duke's aging hunting dog abandoned his usual place beside Julian's study to follow her faithfully through gardens and corridors, refusing every attempt to send him elsewhere. Julian watched these quiet acts from a distance. He finally understood that Rosalie never transformed Ashford Castle through grand gestures. She simply noticed every lonely corner others overlooked. Late one evening he found her standing beneath the restored rose arbor. "You've changed this place." She smiled gently. "No. It changed because people remembered how to care again." He wanted to tell her she had become far more than a temporary wife. Instead he merely reached for her hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally. Neither spoke. Words seemed painfully inadequate. Rosalie knew remaining would only deepen wounds destined to follow them forever. The council already possessed enough evidence to destroy Julian's inheritance. If she disappeared before the hearing, perhaps Lord Victor's accusations would lose their purpose. Society might believe she alone orchestrated everything, allowing Julian to reclaim respect without continuing the impossible marriage. Before sunrise the next morning, she quietly packed only the belongings she had brought from the village. She left every elegant gown, every jewel, every gift. Nothing purchased for the Duchess belonged to Rosalie Everhart. She walked one final time through silent halls touched by pale morning light. The hunting dog whimpered softly beside the front entrance, sensing farewell before anyone else. Kneeling, she embraced the faithful old companion, whispering gratitude into silver fur before gently urging him back toward the warmth of home. Inside Julian's private study, she removed her wedding ring. Beside it she carefully placed the original contract she had secretly recovered after discovering Lady Celeste's theft through the frightened footman who confessed everything. Beneath both rested a folded handwritten letter sealed with one pressed white rose from the restored garden. Without looking back again, Rosalie stepped into the waiting dawn and disappeared beyond the castle gates. Hours later Julian returned from urgent meetings expecting to prepare their defense together. Instead he found an empty room, a silent corridor, and the ring resting upon the contract like the final note of a heartbreaking melody. With trembling hands he reached for the unopened letter, unaware that every word inside would demand the greatest decision of his life. Julian stood alone inside his study long after the morning sun had climbed above Ashford Castle. The wedding ring rested upon the contract exactly where Rosalie had left it, while her folded letter trembled between his fingers before he even opened it. He had faced political rivals, hostile landowners, and years of loneliness without fear, yet never had a single piece of paper felt so impossibly heavy. He slowly unfolded the letter. Her graceful handwriting carried neither anger nor regret. She thanked him for believing in an ordinary village teacher when the world had overlooked her. She wrote that Ashford Castle deserved a duke whose reputation remained untouched by scandal, and that the orphanage had already received enough money to survive because of his generosity. She begged him not to search for her, insisting that if disappearing protected his inheritance, then every sacrifice had been worthwhile. The final sentence blurred beneath tears he never expected to shed. "You taught me that duty can wear kindness instead of pride. I only wish I had met you before our love belonged to a contract." Julian closed his eyes. For years he had believed love weakened judgment. Now he understood something far more frightening. Life without Rosalie would make every victory meaningless. He rose with quiet certainty, carried the contract into the fireplace, then stopped before the flames touched its edges. Destroying it alone would not end Lord Victor's scheme. The truth had to be spoken openly no matter the cost. Within the hour he summoned his solicitor. "I'm withdrawing from the inheritance hearing." The elderly man stared in disbelief. "Your Grace, if you refuse to defend your claim, everything passes to Lord Victor." Julian's voice remained calm. "Then Ashford Castle was never truly mine." Without waiting for another argument, he left the castle on horseback. The servants watched from the steps as their duke disappeared beyond the gates without escorts or ceremony. None knew where he was going, but each silently prayed he would bring their Duchess home. His journey carried him across villages, forests, and quiet country roads where Rosalie's kindness had quietly taken root long before she became Duchess. In one market town an elderly baker smiled warmly after hearing her name. She spent 3 winters teaching poor children to read behind my shop. Farther north, a widowed seamstress remembered Rosalie repairing clothes for families unable to pay. A parish priest recalled how she secretly purchased medicine for strangers using money she barely possessed herself. Every story revealed another piece of the woman Julian loved. She had never sought recognition. She simply left every place gentler than she found it. Meanwhile, Lord Victor celebrated too early. He confidently informed the royal council that Julian's absence proved guilt. Lady Celeste appeared beside him wearing elegant mourning colors, quietly suggesting Ashford Castle required a practical duchess capable of protecting noble traditions instead of village dreams. Several council members seemed persuaded. Others remained uneasy. None had expected Julian Ashford to abandon his inheritance without explanation. Late on the 3rd evening, Julian finally reached the orphanage. Children laughed beneath old oak trees whose branches stretched protectively across the worn courtyard. Fresh vegetables grew where neglected soil had once stood barren. New paint brightened cracked walls. The building no longer looked forgotten. Rosalie had already begun rebuilding hope. A little boy noticed the weary horseman first. "Your Grace." Within seconds half the orphanage raced toward him. Julian barely had time to dismount before tiny arms wrapped around his coat. The children spoke all at once. "Miss Rosalie smiles less now. She still plays piano every evening. She keeps looking toward the road." Their innocent words broke the final walls around his guarded heart. Rosalie stepped quietly onto the porch. For a long moment neither moved. Distance disappeared. The noise faded. Only silence remained. She wore the same simple blue dress she had worn the day he first proposed their impossible bargain. No jewels. No crown. Yet she had never looked more beautiful. "You weren't supposed to come," she whispered. "I know. You'll lose everything." He smiled softly. "I already did the day you left." Tears filled her eyes. "I couldn't destroy your future." Julian slowly approached until only one step separated them. "My future isn't made of castles. It isn't measured in titles. It isn't written inside contracts. It begins wherever you are." Rosalie lowered her gaze, struggling against emotions she could no longer hide. "The council. The inheritance. Your family's name. They matter." He gently shook his head. "They mattered. You matter more." At that very moment, several carriages rolled into the orphanage courtyard. With trembling hands he reached for the unopened letter, unaware that every word inside would demand the greatest decision of his life. Julian stood alone inside his study long after the morning sun had climbed above Ashford Castle. The wedding ring rested upon the contract exactly where Rosalie had left it, while her folded letter trembled between his fingers before he even opened it. He had faced political rivals, hostile landowners, and years of loneliness without fear, yet never had a single piece of paper felt so impossibly heavy. He slowly unfolded the letter. Her graceful handwriting carried neither anger nor regret. She thanked him for believing in an ordinary village teacher when the world had overlooked her. She wrote that Ashford Castle deserved a duke whose reputation remained untouched by scandal, and that the orphanage had already received enough money to survive because of his generosity. She begged him not to search for her, insisting that if disappearing protected his inheritance, then every sacrifice had been worthwhile. The final sentence blurred beneath tears he never expected to shed. "You taught me that duty can wear kindness instead of pride. I only wish I had met you before our love belonged to a contract." Julian closed his eyes. For years he had believed love weakened judgment. Now he understood something far more frightening. Life without Rosalie would make every victory meaningless. He rose with quiet certainty, carried the contract into the fireplace, then stopped before the flames touched its edges. Destroying it alone would not end Lord Victor's scheme. The truth had to be spoken openly no matter the cost. Within the hour he summoned his solicitor. "I'm withdrawing from the inheritance hearing." The elderly man stared in disbelief. "Your Grace, if you refuse to defend your claim, everything passes to Lord Victor." Julian's voice remained calm. "Then Ashford Castle was never truly mine." Without waiting for another argument, he left the castle on horseback. The servants watched from the steps as their duke disappeared beyond the gates without escorts or ceremony. None knew where he was going, but each silently prayed he would bring their Duchess home. His journey carried him across villages, forests, and quiet country roads where Rosalie's kindness had quietly taken root long before she became Duchess. In one market town an elderly baker smiled warmly after hearing her name. "She spent 3 winters teaching poor children to read behind my shop." Farther north, A widowed seamstress remembered Rosalie repairing clothes for families unable to pay. A parish priest recalled how she secretly purchased medicine for strangers using money she barely possessed herself. Every story revealed another piece of the woman Julian loved. She had never sought recognition. She simply left every place gentler than she found it. Meanwhile, Lord Victor celebrated too early. He confidently informed the royal council that Julian's absence proved guilt. Lady Celeste appeared beside him wearing elegant mourning colors, quietly suggesting Ashford Castle required a practical duchess capable of protecting noble traditions instead of village dreams. Several council members seemed persuaded. Others remained uneasy. None had expected Julian Ashford to abandon his inheritance without explanation. Late on the third evening, Julian finally reached the orphanage. Children laughed beneath old oak trees whose branches stretched protectively across the worn courtyard. Fresh vegetables grew where neglected soil had once stood barren. New paint brightened cracked walls. The building no longer looked forgotten. Rosalie had already begun rebuilding hope. A little boy noticed the weary horseman first. "Your Grace." Within seconds half the orphanage raced toward him. Julian barely had time to dismount before tiny arms wrapped around his coat. The children spoke all at once. "Miss Rosalie smiles less now. She still plays piano every evening. She keeps looking toward the road." Their innocent words broke the final walls around his guarded heart. Rosalie stepped quietly onto the porch. For a long moment neither moved. Distance disappeared. The noise faded. Only silence remained. She wore the same simple blue dress she had worn the day he first proposed their impossible bargain. No jewels. No crown. Yet she had never looked more beautiful. "You weren't supposed to come," she whispered. "I know. You'll lose everything." He smiled softly. "I already did the day you left." Tears filled her eyes. "I couldn't destroy your future." Julian slowly approached until only one step separated them. "My future isn't made of castles. It isn't measured in titles. It isn't written inside contracts. It begins wherever you are." Rosalie lowered her gaze, struggling against emotions she could no longer hide. "The council. The inheritance. Your family's name. They matter." He gently shook his head. "They mattered. You matter more." At that very moment, several carriages rolled into the orphanage courtyard.